Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And now it's finally time that we talk about the new album from Björk, titled Vulnicura. And now we come to an artist in which I've got kind of a complicated relationship. The sort I can definitely respect but not quite love. One I understand but struggle to like. An artist that received critical acclaim all throughout her career, but a career that I'd ultimately brand as pretty uneven. Yep folks, it's time that I finally talk about Björk. Icelandic singer-songwriter and one of the most distinctive and unique performers of her time. Breaking in the mid-90s as a solo act, Björk immediately established herself through her uniquely expressive voice and half-playful, half-tragic approach to her delivery and songwriting. And for the longest time, that voice of hers really put me off getting into her. It was unearthly and surprisingly visceral, but never really gripping me as much as I wanted it to. And one of the reasons this review is as late as it is because I went back and listened through Björk's entire discography in depth before covering this album, which leaked months ahead of schedule. I thought I'd have more time. So, with the benefit of some added context here, what do I think of Björk? Well, while I've come to appreciate her and have found some of her material very powerful and evocative, she can be kind of hit and miss for me. Like most critics, I tend to like her 90s and early 2000s material a lot more than her releases in the late 2000s. Mostly because those newer records have some great ideas that don't quite materialize as well as I'd hope. Part of this comes through in a change in focus, in that most of Björk's early work had a more intimate, almost primal thematic focus, which allowed her off-kilter vocals and abstract lyrics to really shine. But starting around Medulla, her material got a lot more fragmented, with experimentation that felt half-realized and really didn't pay the same dividends as they did on previous albums. The a cappella focus on Medulla, the horns on Volta, especially that attempted blend of delicate melodies with the half-formed spasmodic grooves of Biophilia, they never really resonated with me in the same way as her earlier material did. And with her lyrics becoming more politically themed and outwardly focused, it just didn't fit as well, and I just couldn't connect with Björk's material in the same way. Now, I'm not saying it didn't have an audience. Some of that material just might not have been for me, but while these records, they felt very thin conceptually and almost a little bit unfinished, lacking the melodic presence and foundation to support the flights of experimentation, which honestly was really disappointing because Björk writes beautiful melodies. But rumor has it that her newest album was coming back down to earth, back to the potent emotions that drove Homogenic and Vespertine. And while Post is probably my favorite Björk album, Vespertine's a close second. So I prepared to revisit her entire discography to prepare, and then the album dropped 2 months early without all of its accompanying artwork and grand presentation. So much for that, but I figured I wanted to be fair and thus went through her entire back catalog regardless. Better late and right than early and uninformed. So I finally had a chance to delve into Vulnicura. Is it the return to form to which we've all been hoping? Well, yeah, it is. And arguably it's done by stripping back to what has always made Björk a really compelling performer in the first place. Expressive vocals, great melodies, and meticulously crafted electronic experimentation. So, yeah, of course, I'm going to echo what a lot of other critics have said and say that Vulnicura is a great album, easily in the top half of Björk records for me. Not quite my favorite, it's hard to beat Post, but there's a lot to really love about this album, and I definitely appreciate that back-to-basics approach that still has enough meaty intellectual material to really dig into. So let's start with the element that I appreciated most on this album, the instrumentation and the production. What I've always loved about Björk's work is her knack for really inventive melodies, and she brought her A game here in her strings arrangements, elegantly poised and yet precisely controlled, and yet there are ragged edges and moments where she went with a more unconventional progression or a time signature that I found really interesting and surprisingly workable. Now there are a few moments melodically that I don't quite love. The opening viola tone on Not Get just didn't click for me, for example, but almost the strings arrangements on this record are just heartbreakingly gorgeous. The low, aching swell of Stonemilker, the grief-stricken and bleak tension of Black Lake, that slightly off-kilter 5/4 groove on Atom Dance, and even more intimidating and dark, almost industrial Mouth Mantra and Quicksand that round out this record. Of course, most of this is courtesy of additional percussion and production provided by Arca and the Hacks and Cloak. And you know what? They really do fit well with Björk on this record, where the strings add poise and melody and swells of gravitas. The percussion from Arca is very skittery, coming in with well-textured bubbles that provide the very thin skeleton to these songs. It adds a sense of brittleness to this record that I really do appreciate, especially with the subject matter. And as with the melodies, there are a few places where the groove just feels a little bit underweight. Could have used a little bit more thicker presence to really drive these songs, but overall, it's a great pairing of producers that really shows how well they complement each other. Great fit here. But really, This album is all Björk, and nowhere is that more apparent than in the vocals. I do miss some of the more visceral power that she can have when she's angry that can be both a little bit alien and terrifying, and yet all the more impressive, but that's not the focus of this album. She's aiming for a more vulnerable delivery, a more mature vulnerability on most of these songs. And man, every quiver of her voice shows the fine-tuned control and delicate touch that she still managed to deliver impressive strength in and of its own right. It's a subtler strength though. She sounds gorgeous on this album, a singular entity, and thus, unfortunately, anyone singing along with her tends to suffer in comparison. I'm not saying that Anthony Hagardi is a bad singer, but in a song all about finding a harmonious balance and love between two hemispheres, that equality, something primal and atomic, I'm sorry, he's just not Björk's equal, and the song really does unfortunately suffer for it. But now we need to discuss lyrics, and if the back to basics approach is most obvious, it's here. The lyrics are almost deceptively simple to decode in comparison with the grandiose metaphors of her earlier work, or especially Biophilia, which is part of the point, because for all intents and purposes, this is a pretty straightforward breakup album, detailing her separation from American artist Matthew Barney. Björk herself even describes the lyrics as having a raw, almost teenage sensibility, and in a sense, that's true in their simplicity, but that doesn't take away from their sheer power, especially coming from Björk's more mature presence and the actual words that she puts forward. It might have a simple construction, but the actual words in themselves reveal more complexity. Now, also this maturity comes through in the album's framing and structure. Including the liner notes of this album are dates for every single song, each representing a specific time before and after the breakup, showing the whole scene develop and how Björk manages to find some vestige of solace in it all. But the most important pieces to discuss themes come through in the details, especially when it comes to actually describing their relationship. Most of it, it's a personality conflict, and a pretty believable one. Lack of communication on both sides, his morose behavior and her impatience and frustration with dealing with all of it. And Björk doesn't shy away from painting a fuller picture. She assumes that she'll be able to get along just fine with the passion fizzling out on Lionsong, and when she tries to make a sexual reconnection on History It Touches, well, she does it by waking him in the middle of the night. Of course it's not going to be great. Of course this leads to the breakup and the sudden realization that her fractured family unit makes her all the more conscious of death, makes her all the more fearful, thus unintentionally sharing some of his feelings like they couldn't have possibly been shared before. That possibility of death of those closer to her scares her for as much as it does in the album closer Quicksand, where there was a possibility that her mother was dying of some serious illnesses. But it's more elemental than that. Less death, but absence and silence of which she's scared, where her fear materializes even more on Mouth Mantra, where she writes about losing her voice and requiring some complex surgery to get it back in full. Originally, both it and Quicksand kind of felt out of place on this album, not really fitting with the breakup narrative, but thematically they fit a lot better, as Björk is struggling to reconcile how to deal with that pain but not get rid of it. It and the experiences behind it are a part of her, and while that pain is very raw now and it's agonizing, dealing with it is better than pretending that it doesn't exist and just squelching it down. Like it or not, Björk's love for her ex-partner, it's a part of her. It will always be a part of her, and that duality of love is quintessential to the human experience. It also presents a decidedly feminine picture of how one deals with that sort of pain and fear. Everything was stilled and hidden away across the first half of the album, a traditionally male perspective on how one deals with that sort of thing. I get that. Whereas that vulnerability and learning to live with that pain and become stronger through it is more of a feminine trait that's traditionally described in that role. And there's a balance that needs to be held between them that I feel is best encapsulated on a lyric on Quicksand that I really do love. When I'm whole, I'm broken. And when I'm broken, I'm whole. Yin and yang, darkness and light. And when that balance breaks, you get pain on both sides, but coming together in favor of something bigger, something more than a composite of those parts, makes it worth it all in the end. So okay, how do I feel about this album? Well, yeah, it's gorgeous, and it's easily one of Björk's best. I wouldn't say I totally love it though. Now, some of the melodies don't quite connect for me, and I still feel that there could have been more details provided on how Björk managed to heal in that process. As good as Mouth Mantra and Quicksand are, they do ultimately feel instrumentally and lyrically a little bit detached from the overall record, but I'm not going to deny there is a ton of passion, raw emotion, and real power to this album presented in a beautifully elegant and surprisingly almost accessible record. It's got the simplicity to it to make it really successful. I bet a lot of people will really relate to it. As such, for me, solid 8 out of 10 and definitely a high recommendation. Folks, after a few of Björk's stranger experiments that didn't always quite work, this is an album you definitely want to take in. Sometimes finding that elemental core, that primal love, that's healing enough. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. What do you guys think about this album? I admit that I might have reached a little bit when it comes to albums interpretation, but I'm always curious how you guys thought about this sort of thing. Leave your comments. I'm always curious. If there's any other albums that you want me to take a look at, and as I said, I know I'm a little bit late to this one, or if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.